What's up guys, MikeCoco back here, bringing you guys a new video on the new costumes of the month for September. This month we have a lot of heroes for a costume. We have four, one of them is a mythic hero and the rest are your legendary slash mythic heroes. So starting off with the heroes that are accessible to everybody, we have Alina's costume. So Alina's costume does not change much, she just changes one important trait. You have your basic 10% buff to the 3 attributes of attack, defense, and HP, but the more interesting part is that her Fury reduction now applies for 2 turns rather than 1. Now typically with most Fury reducers, you need to have their skill set to always use or always active, because if you ever encounter a turn where you do not apply their skill, then on the turn after that, their skill will run out and you will no longer have the Fury reduction. So to demonstrate this very quickly, I'm going to use our standard Fury reducers. I'm just going to go with Sarah. This applies to Alina and Tehu as well. So on the first turn when you use your skill, it's going to be your base Fury cost, which is 200 Fury, which is pretty normal. It'll be 300 for Alina and 200 for Tehu. So now the turn after, Sarah has 100 Fury cost now for her skill. But if I choose not to use her skill for whatever reason, if I want to just gain some Fury, or if I don't have enough Fury to use her skill, then on the next turn, her skill goes back to 200 Fury. Now, with Alina's new costume, it means that you can actually apply the skill on the first turn, not use her skill on the second turn, and on the third turn you can then use her skill, and her Fury cost will still only be 150, which is only 50 more than Sarah. And you may be thinking, this is not that great, but in a lot of cases where you are reliant on Fury, such as Mythic Raid or Explorer, you might not always have the extra 100 Fury to cast Sarah's skill. Sometimes you have that 100 Fury and you really want your damage dealers to go, because let's say it's the last turn and you probably won't survive the next turn. You can deal just that extra bit of damage from your damage dealer, and instead of wasting it on Sarah to apply her skill again, you can use it on a damage dealer. And this is pretty much the only reason why Alina is effective, is because you don't have to keep applying her skill every turn. Now quantitatively, Alina actually still uses more Fury than Sarah, because if we just look at over 3 turns, Alina will have to go on the first turn and on the third turn, which means she spends 300 for the initial cost and 150 for the third turn, which is a total of 450 Fury. Now Sarah, if we look over 3 turns, she has to apply her skill on the first turn, which is 200 Fury, the second turn, which is another 100 Fury, and the third turn, which is 400 Fury. And you're wondering, Alina still uses 50 more Fury, but on the second turn, you can be at 0 Fury, and the buff will still apply. So that's the magic and pretty much beauty of Alina's skill, and I think that's very effective for any modes where you're very reliant on Fury, such as Mythic Raid or Explorer. So that's what I see in Alina's skill. Sarah will not have the skill in the future via her costume, so it may be worth looking at getting Alina. Now Big Tao is a S2 hero, so because he's one of the lower season heroes, he gets a bigger boost, a 20% boost. And his skill gets changed so that it increases the weapon activation chance for spear heroes by 10% and increases critical hit damage by 0.2%. Now these two numbers probably scale. I don't know what it scales to because I don't have the costume, nor do I have Big Tao. I suspect this probably scales to 50%, maybe if we're lucky, and this probably scales to around 20%. Now, weapon activation chance for spear heroes is pretty much only useful if you have Michael. So if you don't have Michael, you can stop listening for now. Just skip Big Tao because there's no point in having him. If you do have Michael, the extra 10% or 20% or 30%, it doesn't matter. It's always going to help you deal more damage, because whenever that active skill applies or activates via the spear, then you're dealing more damage because Michael can only apply normal attacks. So if you are running Michael, I suggest you try Big Tao's costume. Even if it only increases it by like, I'd say even maybe 30 or 40%, it's still worth getting, because if you think about it from a long-term perspective, if your Michael is very strong, it doesn't matter what hero you replace him with. If you remove Big Tao and put in another damage dealer, if your Michael is strong enough, they might still deal more damage because of the activation chance. and also because the critical hit damage is also increased. Now you might look at this and think, 0.2%, that's probably nothing, it doesn't really do anything. But if it scales to even 20%, you can see from the spear hero's critical damage, it's 200, which means that their crits will always deal 200% of whatever their skill normally says. So if, let's say, Nef's skill right now says 180,000 damage. If she crits, she's going to deal 200% of that, which is 360. And even with Big Tao, the 20% buff means that she's going to be dealing like what, 20, I think, some quick mental math, 39, no, 39, 396,000 damage, more or less. I'm doing mental math, but that's around 30k extra damage. And this is very little damage. This is because my Nef is very poorly geared. If you're comparing it to someone like my strongest heroes like Lucida, her skill does 1.2 mil damage. Another 20%, that's quite significant. So the critical damage, I suggest you not ignore it because it is very important. And for heroes that have crit buffs, the critical damage will pretty much be the same thing as an attack buff, because the crits will be so often. So that's for Big Tao. I would recommend him only if you're using Michael. Otherwise, I would consider either Alina or Nef. So Nef is one of our long-term heroes. People have been using her for a long time. Her skill, I believe, was actually bugged for a while. Her skill described her as dealing magic damage, and I think that's why she was hitting very hard in PvP, because for some reason she was dealing magic damage like Claire. And it's just very weird. It's been fixed now, I think. The description has been fixed. I don't know if she ever was actually dealing magic damage because I never pulled a legendary Nef, so I have no idea. But now that her costume is here, she actually does deal magic damage with her skill, and increases the crit rate, just standard stuff. It's the same thing as your default Nef, except it's just magic damage. Now, Nef as a damage dealer is not a terrible thing. Her mythic skill increases damage to bosses, which is pretty nice. And because she's a spear user, her damage is pretty consistent as the game allows it to be. And with magic damage, she's almost like Claire. But the closest comparison to Nef is actually Prame. Prame's costume was basically the same thing. It converted her to magic damage, and she dealt a fire dot, I believe, instead of a magic dot. And also increased the crit rate for 2 turns. Now, some person, I don't remember their name, a person at the forums, they tested Nef's crit rate buff, and it's only around 40%, which is quite less than Prame's 75%. So my recommendation for your costumes for this month would be, if you don't have Prame, or actually, I'll reword it. If you have Prame, or if you have Prame's costume and you're waiting to pull Prame, I would skip Nef's costume, because Prame is simply better than Nef in pretty much every way. The 75% buff is actually quite drastic because it increases the crit rate a lot, to the extent that pretty much all my heroes crit during Explore whenever they're within the vicinity or of Prame's crit buff. So that's the huge difference between a 40% buff and a 75% buff. You definitely want the 75% because it's pretty much a guaranteed crit at that point, because it's just so high. So if you have Prame, or if you have Prame's costume and you're waiting for Prame, I would definitely stick with Prame and just skip Nef's costume. You aren't missing out too much on the increased damage to bosses for Nef's myth skill, and you pretty much just aren't missing much with Nef. So if you do have Prame, like I said before, or if you have Prame's costume, I would go with Alina instead, because Alina's 2-turn buff thing, Fury consumption reduction, is actually more versatile than Nef, I believe. Although if you're using maybe Tehu or Tehu and Mythic Raid, it might not be that relevant because Tehu has that Fury reduction for a few turns. So if you don't have Prame, or if you don't have Prame's costume, I would suggest Nef, because you definitely want to take advantage of Nef's crit buff. It's still decent, although not as great as Prame's buff. So overall, I think this month's costumes are actually decent. You can actually pick or choose Alina or Nef. They're both very good. but they serve different purposes. Nef simply just increases damage, and Alina allows you to work a little bit more fury. It requires a bit more strategy, and of course, it requires your Alina to be well ranked because she is quite squishy as a magic user. So um, just take note of that. And lastly, the costume for, is it Raphael, I believe? And she's actually a girl. I thought it was a guy. It's actually a girl. Now, her skill doesn't change much either. She reduces defense, increases attack like normal, but she increases the critical hit damage by 0.3%. And like I said before with Big Tao, even though it's just critical hit damage, you can often compare this to basically an attack up, especially if you're using heroes like Prame, which pretty much give you instant and guaranteed crits. The increased critical hit damage is significant. It's quite significant, in fact, and I would compare it to attack up if you're getting crits that often. So Raphael is definitely not a bad costume to get if you have her, but pretty much for this month's costume, you can't really go wrong with either Alina or Nef. It's up to you. It pretty much depends on what you have already, Pram, and how well leveled your Nef or your Alina is, because otherwise you can't really take advantage of their costume in the certain modes like Explore or Mythic, because they just get one-shotted easily. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the costumes. The one extra thing that Legion posted was that they extended the Rune reinforcement event, which is very nice. I personally think that it should be a permanent event, or even if it's not permanent, like a semi-permanent where it runs every other week, because to be honest, the RNG, we all know the RNG is terrible, and it's not like they're losing any money by not having the buff, because people are always going to get runestones, and the people who are going to buy runestones with real money are still going to buy runestones with real money, even if you have it as a permanent event. So it doesn't really matter, I think. But that's pretty much it for the costumes, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.